Welcome to the Center for Climate and Security's Climate and Security podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. Viewers will know that twice a month, we bring you exclusive dialogues with the world's leading thinkers, educators, military personnel, and civil servants who work at the nexus of climate and security. I ask these experts to share with us their views and their perspectives of how to collectively best prepare for this time of high consequence risk, particularly that of climate change. Today's podcast guest is Michael Lowder. Michael currently runs his consulting and advisory business. Prior to this, he served as the director of the Office of Intelligence, Security, and Emergency Response for the U.S. Department of Transportation, which was his last role in government after 47 years of service. He has also served as the deputy director of the Response Division for FEMA and was even a special agent with the U.S. government. Wow, Michael, quite the career. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Sweta. Pleasure to be here.
So, Michael, how do we classify critical infrastructure? What does that mean?
Well, critical infrastructure, as defined by the Patriot Act, is any system or combination of systems or assets that are so vital to the U.S. that if we lost that or they were compromised, that, again, it would have such a tremendous impact on our security, our economic security, our public health and safety. So again, it's something that we must protect.
And so when was that established? And has it changed? Has it evolved as we've developed new infrastructure and technologies?
Yeah, it has evolved because as we think more about it, we learn that critical infrastructure is really a system of systems that, you can have things like the banking infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, the other parts of our infrastructure, but they're not standalone. We found that they're all related, and that if you impact one, that cascades, or what I call ripples, into affecting the other parts of the infrastructure. So again, it's really a system of systems. And again, we've learned more about that. We've learned more about the impacts, how that protecting one protects others, and looking at some of the vulnerabilities that we've identified has helped us, I think, really do a better job in protecting all of our critical infrastructure.
And so when you say ours, obviously this is a collective good for all stakeholders involved, but really the users is the one that's obvious to all of us, as in that we all partake in this infrastructure. But then what about the owners and the operators? How do they view critical infrastructure? What do they need to be concerned about regarding its availability, effectiveness, ability to run and operate?
Well, most infrastructure, as you point out, in the U.S., is not owned by the government. It's all privately owned, privately operated. So again, there's been huge investments, sometimes by government, but in a lot of cases by the private sector, to develop and implement this infrastructure that we all depend upon and we all rely on. Some of it is done by government, but most of it's not. So again, we have to collectively work to protect it so that we all can continue to benefit from it. Our infrastructure helps us maintain our way of life, our economic viability. And if we lose it, then we all suffer.
Sure, and I imagine there's many threats that are of concern to those who really have ownership of looking after this critical infrastructure. Given that we are the Center for Climate and Security, I'm gonna challenge you to talk specifically, at least initially, about what are the climate-related threats that concern those who are really responsible for ensuring our well-being and safety as we engage with all of this infrastructure.
Well, Sweta, from a climate standpoint, changes like sea level rise, periods of extended drought, all these have a direct impact on portions of the infrastructure. Obviously, the most dramatic would be a sea level rise on coastal areas, where that portions of our coastal area would be inundated, be underwater. For example, one study back in 2008 looked at and identified areas along the Gulf Coast region that a 1 meter rise in sea level would inundate over 2,400 miles of roadway, over 250 miles of railroad line, 3 airports, and 75% of all of the freight distribution facilities in that region. And that's just that infrastructure. That doesn't look at or talk about how many houses and businesses, doesn't address the economic impacts. So again, that's just from sea level rise. If you look at the other side of the coin, where that you have an extended drought like we're experiencing in much of the country, like in the West Coast right now, again, we're going to have more wildfires, more severe wildfires, more impact on our electrical distribution system. Again, and all those, again, that ripple effect impacts all of us. And that's just just a few examples. Again, drastic changes in temperature, even though it occurs over long periods of time, will affect our infrastructure. Our infrastructure was planned and designed for a certain set of conditions. Once those conditions change, then it has impacts, and those impacts affect us.
Sure, and it's not necessarily, we're not able to adjust, and it's not necessarily that it's flexible, that we can adjust with it or adjust it according to new conditions and new needs. And so it is a static infrastructure that hasn't necessarily been thought forward to these new conditions and impacts, or the varying levels of impacts. So perhaps it's able to withstand a certain level of sea level rise, but not a higher projected level of sea level rise. So where does that fit in terms of what it can withstand?
You're absolutely right. It's hard to pick up an airport and move it just because the water rises a little bit. And a lot of these things, a lot of the infrastructure was designed and planned without taking these factors, these climate change factors, into consideration. Nobody thought about it at that time, because most of our infrastructure has been in place for a long, long period of time. The thing is that going forward, we are being more cognizant of potential changes and trying to design and incorporate those potential changes, or where we think they're going to go, into how our infrastructure is designed, and where we place it, how we protect it. We're looking at how we can make it more resilient, so that we don't have these same kinds of problems in the future. But again, we have to address what we already have in place as well as what we're looking at for the future.
So as we think about new builds and better planning around the conditions that are foreseeable, and so it would be irresponsible to do anything less than really plan through the various scenarios that we might experience. What does that mean for what we already have in place? Is there a way to make our existing buildings and roadways more resilient? Do we just move away from them? Do we give them up? How do we adapt what we already have?
Well, in some cases, there are ways to mitigate that. And again, many people are looking at that. Others are going to be far more difficult. It's going to be very, very expensive to do some of them. But again, because of the fact that they are so critical, we have to do that. We can build, for example, in some areas, we can build levees and things like that to protect portions of it. Other things that, like in some parts of the country, for example, after Hurricane Sandy, when a lot of the flooding that occurred from Hurricane Sandy inundated a lot of the control systems, and they had to be replaced. Well, instead of just replacing them where they were, they elevated them. So again, they tried to learn the lesson and look towards the future. So if this happens again, and it will, that they're at a higher level, so there will be less likely to be inundated and less likely to be damaged in the future.
So we're talking exclusively about climate change, but I'm curious, given your experience at the Department of Transportation and FEMA, it's not just natural disasters, which we know are increasingly attributed to human causes and actions, but what are the other threats? Where does climate change fall along the list of various impacts that could potentially upset our critical infrastructure?
Climate change is one of many different hazards that we all look at. And we try to look at those collectively, and we try to take an all-hazard approach. But there are some uniquenesses of some things. Again, a terrorist attack. Again, our infrastructure in many cases is very vulnerable. And the fact that it is a soft target makes it very attractive to somebody who wants to do us harm. And again, but at the same time, protection against a terrorist attack may be the same level of protection against maybe a seismic event or a flood event or something like that. So we're going to try to look at again, dual-use technology, if you will, so that we can protect against all hazards as opposed to just taking them one by one. But again, it is something that we are very concerned about from an attack standpoint, because if you take out a significant bridge, again, it can cause significant catastrophic impacts to us, our residents, our economy, our national security. So again, we want to make sure that we are taking all the measures necessary to protect those.
What were the types of threats that you saw during your tenure in government that were acted upon proactively? I'm curious to see as to what types of various predictions or obvious threats result in action and movement or policy movement even.
Well, one we mentioned earlier was Superstorm Sandy. And again, that is an indication of what we can expect with climate change. More intense storms, more extreme weather. The officials in New York knew that there would be a storm surge, and they planned for that. But the problem was the storm surge that actually occurred was far more significant than what they had planned for. So therefore we had significant flooding. All the tunnels in Manhattan were flooded. And that was again a significant identifier of what we can expect if we don't protect these things.
So that wasn't predicted, but it's that sort of information that now you are armed with, or the departments are armed with, so that they can go forward with that much more information and be that much better.
The levels were predicted to be less than what they were.
Got it.
We knew that there could be inundation. There would be a storm surge. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think that they thought that the storm surge would be less than 6 feet. So they planned and they put up barricades and sandbags or whatever to a 6-foot level. Well, the storm surge turned out to be 11 feet. So again, in essence, they didn't have anything. So that was an indication of how much more dramatic it can be than what we had previously thought. And taking that and extrapolating that into the future, so that when we're planning and we're building and we're repairing and replacing, that we're taking these lessons learned and incorporating those into our new designs, into our repairs and our renovations and things like that. So to include other things, I mean, something like instead of having to go out and physically put sandbags up, have whether we can have shutters that will close and maintain a level, so we can seal things off. But that's just one example. Another would be enhancing the seismic protection on roads and bridges, overpasses, tunnels, things like that. Not just protecting against seismic activity, but again, it also raises the level of protection against a terrorist or a bomb. So again, we get more benefit than just one particular hazard. Looking at how we address the wildfire situation because of extreme droughts, preparing for and planning, being able to manage our resources better to try to, one, prevent those or to mitigate them when they do occur. Some other areas of concern that we've seen in the past, which doesn't seem, we don't think about it a lot, but we had situations in the Pacific, some of the small islands, because of the drought out in the Pacific, where that people out there literally were running out of drinking water. And that we had to bring in material so they could desalinate ocean water to maintain drinking water. At the same time, they're very concerned about sea level rise, because most of these islands, some of these small islands, they're only just a foot or two above sea level. So a meter rise in sea level would put these islands completely underwater. So again, in another areas where that we're concerned about is, for example, places like South Florida. A meter rise in sea level would require 4.5 million people in 7 counties in Florida to have to relocate. Where are they going to go to? Look about that ripple effect. Okay, once you have to move these 4.5 million people, okay, we move them to other parts of, South Florida. but look at the impacts that those additional people, the additional congestion, the additional energy demands and things like that, all have to be addressed. Look at from the economic losses of all of a sudden you've lost buildings, property, and things like that. The economic impact is going to be significant.
So thank you for illustrating that. I mean, that helps viewers really be able to visualize the scale of what potentially could come if we're not more proactive. And you're in a really unique position in that you've been very proactive and you've thought about past risks and what that means for expecting future impacts and various risks and hazards and what they could look like and their ripple effects. And you've also been with FEMA, and so you've been involved with relief and recovery. So you've been on both sides, being proactive and then reacting post-disaster or post-event. What would you say the balance is? Is one kind of bigger than the other? Are they equally balanced? Where should the balance be? And what does FEMA want to see? Do we want less relief and recovery ultimately? Because those ripple effects can really rack up.
Now, FEMA is very committed and dedicated toward preventing disasters. Their focus is working with people to help them prepare for, mitigate, prevent, do the things that need to be done so that they aren't impacted. Like not building in a floodplain. Why build in an area that you know you're going to be flooded? If you're already there, make sure that you have flood insurance so that you're able to recover from it. So no, FEMA is very dedicated toward preventing it and mitigating the effects. But when it does occur, to be able to respond very quickly and to help people. So again, it's a combination of both. You have to be prepared, and again, and preparedness starts at the very local level. It starts with an individual. You always say preparedness starts with you, and then it goes to your family, and then it goes to your neighborhood, then your community, then your city, your county, your state, and then ultimately the nations. But again, it really begins, individuals have to be more aware. They have to understand. This is where something like this helps so many people better understand what can happen, what the potential is, so that they can hopefully understand the need to be better prepared, take mitigation steps and things like that.
Would you say that would be one of the biggest challenges in proactively preparing for these types of inevitable impacts that we're going to be seeing?
Yes, ma'am.
It's an
Absolutely.
Awareness issue?
It's an awareness.
What else has been the challenge, especially from your various tenures in government? What was the most challenging obstacle in being able to really be proactive?
A lot of it is to get people to understand, because nobody thinks it will happen to them. That we see it in the paper, on the media, on social media, that something's happened somewhere else. But we never think it will happen to us. And we've got to change that it can and it will happen to us if we don't take steps to prevent it. So that's been a huge challenge, is to educate people, to help them understand that if you see a body of water, if you have a house near a body of water, whether it's a river or a stream or whatever, it can flood, and it will flood. I remember one person that I knew had bought a brand new house right on the edge of a river, and they were so proud of it, and they said they should be. I said, well, do you have flood insurance? They said, no, they told us we don't need flood insurance because it's never flooded here. I said, well, that's wrong. I said, they may not have remembered it flooding, but it has flooded in the past, and it will flood again. And unfortunately, following a hurricane, that river did flood, and those people, they lost their house. Luckily, they took the suggestion and bought flood insurance, and FEMA was able to help them. But if we see something like that, it will happen. Just because we don't remember it doesn't mean that it'll never happen.
Sure. And this is where my complementary background to some of the work that you do and my background in cognitive behavioral science explains this phenomenon in terms of human behavior as optimism bias, and that you just think, this is not going to happen to me, this will happen to the other person. Or, okay, that's a typhoon, that's not going to impact me, even though it's a hurricane on my shores, that's happening way over there. So really changing this culture of I'm immune and really communicating and raising awareness is what I hear that you're saying we need here.
And they need to remember that just because it's not happening local doesn't mean that it won't impact them.
Right.
During one of the storms in the past years, in the hurricanes in the Gulf, it had caused a shutdown of all the petroleum refineries in the Louisiana Gulf Coast region. The ripple effect was that has an impact on aviation because they were no longer able to produce aviation fuel, jet fuel, which meant that the pipelines were empty. They weren't able to pump it to all the airports on the East Coast. So that there was a potential that airports here in Washington or in Richmond or up and down the East Coast would have to shut down and cancel flights because they couldn't get jet fuel. We were able to work through it and be able to shift deliveries and things like that. But again, something happened in the Gulf Coast that would have a direct impact on the East Coast. Another case would be that if we have a major earthquake that impacted pipelines, particularly in the winter region, that could have a devastating impact on the Northeast, which relies on pipelines to deliver heating oil and gas. There's no, if those are shut down because of damage from whatever, again, that could have a tremendous impact on the livelihood and the comfort and the survivability of a lot of people up in the New England area.
Sure, and that's a fantastic illustration in that I think a lot of what people assume is the damage control or the costs associated with these events are, relief, recovery, rebuilding, without really thinking about all of those extensive ripple effects that really add up and the costs become astronomical.
Absolutely.
And so the hurricane season of 2017 was over $300 billion in costs and associated costs. The wildfires are in the billions now too. So from your expert point of view, how are we going to afford this? What do we do? How do we bring down that relief and recovery cost and reduce the after effects and the ripple effects and put more money into the proactive to potentially reduce the not to put words in your mouth, but wouldn't that potentially bring down the post-recovery costs?
That's what has to be done, Sweta. We have to, it's like the old saying, pay me now or pay me later. If we don't do what we need to do now to prevent this, to mitigate it, it's going to cost us more later. And I talk about this a lot at a lot of groups and conferences and things like that. And one thing that I hear is, oh, well, it costs so much to do this. Well, that's not the right question. The right question is, what will it cost us if we don't do that? And when we see that, we're starting to see that, and people need to understand that if you made an investment to put your infrastructure in place, okay, we need that, we require that. Shouldn't we? And the answer is yes, we should. We should do what we need to protect that infrastructure so that we don't lose it, so that we don't have to rebuild it, we don't have to replace it, we don't have to worry about moving it. So again, if we do it right now and protect it, we will save money. And FEMA, I think, is in the past, they've talked about, again, they may have even have better figures now, that for every dollar that's spent to protect something, you save $4 to $5 later on. So again,
and again, isn't it an incredible phenomenon that human beings balk at spending, let's say, $100 million in protection or proactive engagement to prevent against these type of impacts, and then don't necessarily, or might be too overwhelmed to understand that it's hundreds of billions on the other side. And that is, we're more accepting to spend that to get things back to how they were, as opposed to just safeguarding it from the beginning. These numbers just get lost. That's another human phenomenon of not really comprehending zeros. Just adding zeros after a certain amount just all look like one massive number. So it's about communicating really what we mean by 100 million in prevention and protection versus 100 billion in recovery.
Right, you're absolutely right.
So where do you see the opportunities here in terms of everything that we've been talking about? Where is there excitement to be generated in it may seem like we have to rebuild and protect and make it more resilient, but in every challenge, there's opportunity. So what do you see as sort of the exciting new frontiers for various stakeholders, whether it's researchers or private sector, playing their role and really contributing to safeguarding us?
A lot of entities, whether it be the private sector, the owners or the operators of infrastructure, government organizations, agencies, things like that, there is a much higher level of awareness and interest in how to do it better, because they've seen that if they don't do it and they don't protect it, it's going to cost them more. Right. So again, there's a much more awareness of that, and resilience is something that's being looked at and addressed more in the early stages as opposed to as an afterthought. We used to have a saying when I was with in DOT, is resilience should be built in, not bolted on. So you should factor that into when you're planning any kind of new project or even a repair. Think about how can we make it stronger, more resilient, so that again we don't have to repair it, so that it can withstand whatever that impact might be. So again, there is more of that. The thing I think that we probably need to spend more effort on is educating the public, so they understand, so they support that, and in many cases they demand that. So again, I think we've done a lot of work in educating and raising the level of awareness amongst infrastructure owners, operators, government officials, things like that. But I still think we probably need to do more with the public.
So what would you say to the public? So let's assume that we have a captive audience listening to us having this conversation. They're hungry for information. What can they do? What can they do? And you were very clear about it all comes down to the individual and taking that action. What is it exactly that you would encourage people to do if they had the time and resources? How would they prioritize it?
Well, I think they can work with their local jurisdictions to help push and support protective measures, mitigation measures, building resilience in. And I think that as citizens, as taxpayers, they should ask those questions. Are we building this to the next level? Are we building it to where we can protect it? Are we going to be going through a problem in 3, 4, 5, 10 years, 12 years, 20 years with a climate change problem? They should be asking those questions and supporting efforts to build that level of protection. I mean, too often times, public officials particularly, but even private sector folks, they're concerned obviously about the cost and the bottom line. And they say, well, yeah, we'd like to be able to build it to here, but it's going to cost this much. But if we build it here, we'll save this much. And they think it's a false economy. So I think that's where the public can say, no, stop, wait a minute. Let's build it one time and not have to rebuild it a couple times because we didn't plan enough.
So ask more questions and challenge maybe the initial response, even do some research and really make sure that you're safeguarding not just your health and well-being, but your property, your assets.
And you're safeguarding your future.
Right.
Again, you want to get, the infrastructure takes a long time to build. Right. I mean, there's big things. I mean, you don't just do it overnight, and when it's damaged, you don't just repair it overnight either. So again, they have to be looking toward the future. Another thing would be to push and support your local officials to do the right thing. I mean, sometimes it's hard for an elected official, a town council or a city manager or something like that, to really go to the mat to push to have that extra level of protection built in. I mean, sometimes they can catch a lot of grief about that. So again, if they would support and encourage that level, then I think that would go a long way. If they saw that the public supported that, the public wanted that. And I've seen that happen in a number of communities where that the public, the taxpayers, the residents said, no, we want extra protection built in so that our property, our way of life, our community is protected. And obviously then, yes, the community, the council, the elected officials did that. But it took that community support to really push it over the edge.
That's great, Michael. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think listeners will be really pleased to hear that there's some examples of the success stories in really coming together and making a case and making their voices heard, because this is not an issue that is going anywhere. This is really becoming and I balk at saying new normal, but a trend that we can anticipate and expect, and we need to be clued in on collectively. So you sharing your background and your expertise is extremely vital to seeing that happen and to see these communities rise up. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us, and I hope you'll would like to come back again and talk with us again.
Sure, I'd be very happy, and thank you for doing this to help educate and raise that level of awareness. Again, it takes things like this and what you're doing to help do that, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Climate and Security Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please tweet me directly at SWETAC or the Center for Climate and Security's Twitter handle. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, write a review on iTunes, share widely, and finally, consider donating to the podcast from the Center of Climate and Security's podcast page, www.climateendsecurity.org/podcast, by clicking on Make a Donation. We will continue the series of conversations with the most prolific and dedicated folks in this space, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you, and please tune in again for the next episode of the Climate and Security Podcast.